Shalom Mishpacha. Hi family. Welcome back to A Small Sanctuary. And as you can see from the flag behind me here, today's topic is going to be dedicated to the LGBTQ community and Judaism. In honor of Pride Month, but also for the 11 other months of the year. So this is a topic that's really important and near and dear to my heart, and I want to welcome you all here and affirm that this is a safe and inclusive space. And at the same time, we're going to be discussing Jewish texts, which might be quite challenging as well. So take care of yourself if you belong to the LGBTQ community and you have had harmful experiences with organized religion or religious doctrine or religious teachings. You can sit this one out. It's really okay. But if you want to learn more and gain a perspective from a progressive Jewish point of view, then come along for the ride and take good care of yourself. There are already a lot of LGBTQ resources out there in the Jewish community. Why am I adding to the mix? In some ways, I am not very well suited to add to the conversation. I am a cisgender female in a heteronormative relationship. There are many queer folks out there who have incredible Torah to teach. So what is my mission with making this video? Well, that is precisely the reason, because I feel it's important for me to add a voice in support of the LGBTQ community in this conversation. So as I partake in this conversation, I want to bring a teaching from Mussar. Mussar is the spiritual discipline of Jewish virtue ethics, where you try to hone your character, your internal midot, your personality traits. And there is a famous saying in the Mussar community that says, "No more than my space, no less than my place." So I bring that consciousness as we explore these topics together, realizing my own limitations. I am not a gender and sexuality studies scholar by any stretch of the imagination. And what I hope to do today is really look at the theological and communal ramifications of this discussion. There are people far more skilled than I am in unpacking all of the nuances that I cannot bring to the table right now. But I do wish to fill the YouTube algorithm with LGBTQ-affirming Jewish content. And I think that is a mitzvah in and of itself. I also want to share a little bit about the culture I come from. I am not American. I come from a Northwestern European culture and family, which has always been very affirming, even already when I was growing up in the 1980s, where gender and sexuality were both to be understood as being on a spectrum. And so this is for me a very old conversation in many ways. And in some ways, when I became active in interpreting Jewish texts and Jewish thought on this topic, I felt like I had to relearn the secular language that I was brought up with, which was inclusive, and understand the resistance felt in traditional Jewish spaces or spaces of other traditional faith groups. And in some ways, that was a very strange experience to me. So for me, I want to bring that sacred intention of affirmation into this space as we look at these questions moving forward. Also, I've said this before in my videos talking about family culture, family in the broadest sense of the word, our kin by blood, but also our kin by choice, that LGBTQ values are family values and are human rights. And I think it's really important to underscore that point as we seek to build relationships of mutual support and solidarity and love in the world, whether by blood or by choice, with the people we call family in our lives. And where to go from here? So I have 3 topics delineated for today's conversation. One is centered around text, i.e. Torah. The other is centered around theology, i.e. God. And the third is centered around community, i.e. the Jewish people. And hopefully we can break down some things that might prove a helpful introduction into the questions of LGBTQ inclusion in Jewish communal spaces. Of course, I have a lot of resources for further learning, and I will share them in the notes below. So please check those out, because there are many great resources and books and texts and other things that can help you in your learning journey. Section 1, text. With text, we really mean the Torah. The Torah is remarkably silent on same gender or same-sex relationships as we understand them today. The only two texts that speak to some form of same-sex encounter are the texts from Leviticus, which are known in theological circles or interpretive circles as the clubber texts, i.e. these are the two verses from Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13, and I will paste them in the video as well, that talk about the prohibition of a male engaging in certain penetrative sex acts with another male. The first text delineates the prohibition. The second text delineates the punishment or the consequence of the prohibition. Now, there are entire books written about these two texts, so I'm not actually going to go into them too much in terms of how we should interpret Mishkevei Isha, a man shall not lie with a man in the lyings of a woman. Does that refer to the marital bed? Does that refer to a certain position? What does that refer to? There's a lot of ambiguity in the text, but I'm not actually going to talk about that all that much. I'll leave that to real biblical scholars to unpack, and you will find those resources below. There are a number of scholars who address this interpretation and this interpretive conundrum directly, and I will refer to them. Rabbis like Danya Rottenberg in her Life as a Sacred Text Substack, and Rabbi J. Michelson in God versus Gay, and Rabbi Steve Greenberg in his book Wrestling with God and Men, which is a slightly older book, but was a really important step for the interpretive Jewish community to really wrestle with these texts in an affirming way. What I do want to talk about a little bit is about the clubber texts of Leviticus and their context. So the context is that there are 3 core chapters in the center of Leviticus, which in turn are in the center of the Torah, known as the Holiness Code. We tend to see these as chapters 18, 19, and 20. Chapter 19 deals a lot with ethics and social justice. This is where we get the pasuk, the verse, V'ahavta l're'acha kamocha, you shall love your fellow as yourself. Chapter 19 overall is really beautiful. Chapter 18 and 20 sandwich chapter 19 and describe a number of cultic prohibitions that the Israelites are not supposed to engage in order to distinguish themselves from other cultures and to maintain moral purity and holiness. And this is why it is called the Holiness Code. And these chapters 18 and 20 that deal with sexual prohibitions actually all deal with these sexual prohibitions. These chapters are called the Arayot, or the nakednesses, or the exposure of the nakednesses, literally translated. The central overarching concern of these texts are power differentials and the violation of safe family bonds, as well as the engaging of cultic practices which can be seen as idolatrous. If you take this view, then it radically shifts away the attention from the ban on homosexual behavior as being between 2 consenting, loving adults in a relationship as we understand it today. So that is kind of a quick gloss that I would like to give you as a different lens through which you can see these texts. And if there are any non-Jewish viewers or Christian viewers who also read these texts as part of their tradition, as part of your tradition, and you know the context for these verses, that might be helpful for you and your community to come to a better understanding of these texts and grapple with the question of, do these texts actually prohibit homosexual love or homosexual relationships. Now, it goes without saying that in traditional communities that are intent on upholding the gender binary and upholding the primacy and sanctity and exclusivity and exclusive sanctity of opposite sex or opposite gender relationships, those communities may still want to read those texts as prohibitive. They have been read as prohibitive for hundreds of years. It's not the only reading, and it's not necessarily always the dominant reading throughout history, and I want to be very careful with that. But I also want to be careful that just because I believe, frankly, that I am right and following the divine will by interpreting these texts in a more expansive way, doesn't mean that it is interpretively incorrect to maintain the traditional bans on same-sex or same-gender relationships. I disagree with that. And I would also challenge those communities for the harm that is perpetuated through that teaching. But I can't deny that if people want to read the text those ways, they can certainly do so. And I will spend my entire rabbinic career and all of my energy arguing against such a reading of these texts, which is why I'm making this video. But for the sake of intellectual honesty, are there communities that read those texts prohibitively in the Jewish world? Absolutely they are. Thankfully, there are also many communities, including the community that I am part of, that chooses to read those texts very differently. Let's press onwards, friends. So we have just discussed sexual acts as prohibited or maybe not prohibited by Leviticus, or human relationships between same gender or same-sex persons as prohibited or maybe not prohibited by Leviticus. How about gender itself? From a narrow reading or a traditional reading of Genesis 1:27, where God makes human beings in God's own image, male and female, God makes them, it would be easy and tempting to infer that this actually reaffirms the gender binary. But it is also credible to propose a different reading, to see this as a merism. What is a merism? It is not a mermaid or a merman, I promise you. A merism is a biblical literary device where two poles are given to suggest everything in between those two poles. So for example, I will praise your name, Eternal One, from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun. That doesn't literally mean that we will only praise God at the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. It means that we will praise God all day long at the rising of the sun, the setting of the sun, and everything in between. And that literary device is called a merism. Now, I think there's a very credible reading where we read this description of God making human beings, male and female, in God's own image, not as a binary, but as a spectrum, as a merism, male and female as both being poles, including everything in between, whether those are trans-masculine or trans-feminine identities, or non-binary or gender-fluid identities, or maybe some unfolding of gender in ways we do not yet understand in our own culture today. I want to give that to you as well as a teaching, so that we cover the whole rainbow, that this is a conversation both about gender identity and about gender or sexual orientation, whatever applies best to you. The second part I want to talk about is theology, and I actually think this is pretty important because there is a quip in the Jewish community that Jews don't do theology, and I couldn't disagree more. I actually think we do plenty of theology. We just don't do one doctrinal, dominant, overarching, systemic theology. Jews do many different theologies. That's what keeps Judaism rich and vibrant. There is not one Jewish theology, but it is important to talk about theology and about the different perspectives on how we're trying to discern divine will through our texts, through our communities, and through our practices and values. So let's talk about God. So I mentioned before that a restrictive reading upholding the prohibitions is authentic to certain communities. I also mentioned before that my community rejects that reading, and I want to tell you why. I hold the Torah's own interpretive processes accountable to the values that the Torah claims to espouse, i.e., I hold the divine voice of the Torah accountable to the standards of the divine voice itself. What do I mean by that? That sounds very kind of meta, right? But if we interpret the Torah to be a book about love and justice and covenant and a story between God and this strange little tribe called the Jewish people who try to discern God's will for themselves and perhaps to some degree for all humanity, then what is the moral thrust throughout the entire Torah? And I would argue quite credibly that that moral thrust, apart from telling the particular story with a universal message of the Jewish people, is a story of love and justice. Now, the Torah is internally contradictory and it is internally dynamic, and that applies to the entire Hebrew Bible as well. And that also applies to rabbinic literature as well. There are many voices in the Torah, but the voice that I hear loudest is the voice of a compassionate God who created everyone in God's own image and extends God's love to all of humanity. And if I use that metric to assess these clobber texts, then I want to say there's something not quite right to the traditional restrictive interpretation of these texts. Let's go back to them and reevaluate. Now, is this cheating? Is this a cop-out? Is this a modern liberal sentimental sop to my modern liberal progressive values? No, actually, I don't think so. It is actually an authentic reading that isn't new. So in the book of Deuteronomy, we have a prohibition of the rebellious son. If a son is rebellious and usurps his parents' authority, then the parents can take him to the city gates and stone him to death. It's an awful verse and nobody likes it. Already in the Talmud, nobody likes it. This is called the passage of the Ben Sorer Umoreh, the rebellious son. And what the rabbis of the Talmud already do is they interpret this out of existence by narrowing the scope of the argument and really narrowing down who actually qualifies as a rebellious son. Because the agenda and the intent of interpreting that verse is to say, this is morally abhorrent to us, and this does not apply to our lives, our age, and our worldview. Now we can do the same with these clobber texts. And I actually think that is a Jewishly authentic approach that is well grounded in our tradition as well. This is a hermeneutical argument, right? You take a text and you analyze it out of existence, essentially. Now the theological underpinnings of that hermeneutical approach is actually to say the spirit with which we do this goes back to what I said earlier about love and justice and human dignity for all human beings. And what would a loving God demand of us? As the later prophets say, what does God demand of you, O human? Only that you love mercy, do justly, and walk humbly with your God. I also think that this is an argument against fundamentalism and literalism. And now I don't live or exist in a fundamentalist or literalist community, but I can't close myself off to the larger conversations in our world where people often encounter fundamentalist communities and the real religious trauma they perpetuate. And one of the reasons why I have a YouTube channel like this is because I want to showcase an authentic, vibrant, loving, passionate form of religious liberalism that we can live while rejecting fundamentalism and affirming our own faith and the integrity and authenticity of our own faith. And I think that's actually a really important project. In my own rabbinic work, I have seen people leave fundamentalist communities and the harm that rigidity and doctrine and fundamentalism cause, especially but not exclusively to our LGBTQ family. It is an important point to make, and maybe I will talk about fundamentalism and literalism and the dangers thereof more in the future. I also want to talk a little bit about 4 theological values which are important in our tradition. Each of these is a world, and we could talk about so much more, and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to restrain myself, and it is hard. 1. B'Tselem Elohim. Each human being is created in the divine image and deserves inherent dignity and respect. 2. Kavod Habriot. Each human being deserves to be treated with dignity, and sometimes this dignity overrides what we understand to be prohibited. Number 3, Ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. LGBTQ inclusion in my book is part of loving my neighbor as myself. And 4, last but certainly not least, there is also a pikuach nefesh argument that everything else needs to be in service of preserving and saving human life. And I refer you to organizations like the Trevor Project about data about the LGBTQ community, especially under young LGBTQ individuals. The last point I want to make in this conversation about theology and God is that arguments in favor of affirmation are, in my view, and I really mean this, and I mean this as a person of faith as well, expressing the divine will in the universe and expressing the continued unfolding of the divine in our universe. I genuinely and wholeheartedly believe that affirming LGBTQ love and identity is not only a good thing and a moral thing and a compassionate thing to do. I actually think it's a mitzvah, it's a sacred commandment, and in complete alignment with the divine will. Too often, the conversation in religious spaces is, well, can we refrain from judgment? Can we tolerate? We must make space for, and it's reactive and regressive. And I'm actually saying, and certainly I'm not the only one, I'm just doing this on my little corner of YouTube, but what I'm actually saying is that none of those strategies, while they're worthy starting points for communities to start out on their journey of affirmation, but none of those are sufficient. We need to say that this is part of who we are as the human family. It is an integral and sacred part of the human family, deserving and worthy of sanctification. Our last section, section number 3, community. The LGBTQ community and the Jewish people. There is a lot to be said about that because so many communities find themselves in different places with this. But I will try to speak to it a little bit. How do we build inclusive community? That is a topic way too large for me to address here. But if you are a member of a Jewish space or community and you want to help out with building a more affirming space in your community, reach out to your communal leaders, whether that's a rabbi or a federation leader or someone else. Proactively reach out to them and say, I want to help create a truly affirming space. Visibility and representation are really important. Encourage yourself or others to be visible and present. Receive a little bit of training on how to manage things that uphold the dignity of the LGBTQ community in your Jewish spaces. How to deal with pronouns, for instance. How to deflect awkward comments or questions or invasive questions. How to accommodate physically, institutionally, organizationally, and spiritually. There is a ton of information out there. But a good guiding question to ask yourself is, how would I feel coming into this space, being as it is, if I had those representational and inclusionary needs? If I am a member of the LGBTQ community, what do I need? And of course, nothing about us without us. ask. Just find a way to find out. I would also encourage you to be empathic and curious, engaging in the learning project of LGBTQ inclusion, if we are not part of that community, can throw up a lot of questions about our own sense of self, who we are, our own sacred and intimate relationships, our own sexual identity, gender identity, sexual or gender attraction. And that can be scary, but it's actually super fun and generative. I have learned so much from the LGBT community, especially in regards to how I construct and perform my own gender as a cisgender woman. What can I take away from that to expand the horizons of my own humanity? There is only something to be gained, nothing to be lost from this at all. So be empathic and curious. There is lots we can do the other 11 months of the year. Like any kind of representational justice that we engage in, where we uplift certain communities who are minoritized. It isn't only about Black History Month. It isn't only about Jewish Heritage Month. It's not only about Pride Month. It's about what happens throughout the year. Now, these times can certainly be points of emphasis programmatically and institutionally, but this work requires all of our attention all of the time. Judaism is about mishpacha, just creating safe and loving spaces for our kin, whether that is by blood or by choice. Just a simple ability to say, welcome, I see you and I cherish you and the gifts you bring. You have come home. I may not be the expert, but it is important for everyday normal people to stand up in defense of the LGBTQ community and in defense of many other communities as well. The cause of justice is wide and the tent of inclusion is large, and it is not a zero-sum game. That is why I take a certain holy chutzpah as a person who is married to a man and who has 3 kids and who leads a really boring, suburban, unremarkable life. It's important for me to speak out and to teach on this while continuing to educate myself and draw on the sources of wisdom that continue to inform my own thinking, which brings us back to that Mussar teaching right at the beginning of this episode about claiming my space and knowing my place. We can all be transformed by what the LGBTQ community teaches us and broadens the horizons of our human experience. I think that is so important. It's not us and them. It's everyone included in figuring out who we are in these human bodies, with these human souls, in these human relationships. The palace of Torah is to be expanded at every turn. And we ourselves are transformed. There is so much sacred wisdom in the language and narratives of the LGBTQ community. Queer theology, philosophy around what it is like to come out, what it is like to transition, what it is like to love in a world that wants to deny you that love. There is really deep, collective, universal human wisdom here. This is not just about us doing the right thing or being decent people. This is about saying, this is yet another pillar of human civilization, yet another well of knowledge and learning that we get to drink from. Let's have a mindset of abundance, not scarcity. That is such a truth for all kinds of experiences in sacred community. The obligation is upon me to learn more in an open-hearted and open-minded way, because abundance is about flourishing and about the unfolding of godliness in our universe. It goes without saying, last but not least, that this channel is a safe space, and this channel is unapologetic in its values. This is important because I am a religious Jew who loves Torah, God, and the Jewish people, and I love my LGBTQ family, and I love being egalitarian, and I love being non-fundamentalist, And I love bringing the philosophical tools of critical inquiry. And I love God. And all those things can be true and must be true. So you are so welcome here. I want to say to my LGBTQ fam, I love you guys. I cherish you guys. I'm so glad you are with us. And I'm so glad that we are expanding the palace of Torah together. Before I close out, I want to show you this book. This is Mishkan Ga'avah, where pride dwells. Ga'avah is the Hebrew word for, well, you've guessed it, pride. And it is a wonderful anthology of different readings and prayers and liturgical texts for the LGBTQ community. So I would like to share a text with you all to close out this episode of A Small Sanctuary. So this is a blessing for pride. I'll show it to you. You can find it on page 130. A blessing for pride. Makor HaChayim, source of life, you have blessed each of us with your spirit. In your wisdom, you have made each of us a unique treasure. Ma'ayan Chayenu, wellspring of our lives, cause us to flow with courage, strength, and compassion, to live our stories openly, proudly, and joyfully. Shekhinah shel Ahava, presence of love, you embrace us with your love. May we embrace ourselves, our partners, our lovers, our friends, our children, our dear ones, with the power of your Ahava Rabbah, your unending, boundless love. Ruach HaShalom, spirit of peace and wholeness, open our eyes to the gifts and blessings we offer and receive from each other. Open our hearts to welcome each other fully and truly. Open our hands to embrace, to support, to lift each other. Begila, berina, uvreut, with joy, with song, and with deep friendship. Today, as we celebrate renewal, pride, and the community, let us walk together with strength, compassion, and love. Nevarech et Mayan Chayenu, Asher Tekadesh, ut Sameach Otanu. We bless you, wellspring of our lives. May you fill us with joy and sanctity. Written by Rabbi Joshua Slochover, Rabbi Erica Steelman, and Dr. Gloria Becker, 2019. If you like this kind of content and you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe, and please share this video with your friends, family, and community. If you found these teachings helpful, please consult the YouTube notes down below for loads of resources and references and further learning. Thank you for joining me today, and wishing you Shalom Uvracha, peace and blessing from my bayit to your bayit.